Hello. This video is about mixing a home recording. I took this home recording by my good friend Jim Robinson that he did in the second grade lockdown that we had. It was great fun, good times then. Yeah, he was at home just like, plugging his guitar straight into the computer, soldered it onto the circuit board, straight in, no preamp. His vocal in the broom cupboard, duvet over his head kind of thing. So I wanted to take something that was recorded in that way and try and glitz it up, glam it up and make it sound as good as I can get it to. Here's what it sounded like before. And here's what it sounded like after. So check out the description below for a link to Jim's SoundCloud, and if you want to hear my version, go to the end of this video or
watch the video.
Right, so the first thing that I do when I get a project is to tidy it all up, make it look nice and make it easy to work with. Color coding and layout especially, and also bussing things. So they're already grouped into kind of stems really. I've done kick, bass, guitars and vocals. It's nice and simple. Drums are always red for me, bass light blue, guitars yellows, different yellows for dark yellow for the lead guitar or distorted guitar really, and light green for the lead vocal and a dark green for the backing vocals. And then I've just put a bus for each one of those stems, so it's nice and easy to isolate certain areas if you're having trouble, say, between the drums and the bass, which is a classic. You can just isolate the drums and the bass, or you can just drop out the whole kit quickly just to hear like what else is going on in your mix. So I just find that really useful. Do that right at the beginning and it makes the whole process a lot easier. Alright, I'll just show you a few things that I did with this mix. So first of all, with the kit, this opening section here is comprised of 3 layers really. I'll put them all next to each other so it's easier to look at. Here we've got a drum kit sample, which is a whole kit being played with like hot rods, I believe, or something. And then what I did, if we put this to a decent scale, just essentially I swept out all the bottom end of it because there's another layer that's dealing with that. So, and then I put this little boost but as an expander on here. So if you make a boost and then you can click here and then go to turn that off, you go to make dynamic there, then you get this little fella here which basically listens to the signal, and when there's information over a certain threshold, which you can set here. So basically I've got it boosting the sort of mid-range kind of ringy type sound on the snare, just to kind of help it poke through a little bit in the mid-range and give it a bit more presence. Let me show you that anyway, before and after. So you can hear it's giving it a nice sharp-edged attack there. Sound a little bit flat with it off, and in the context of the whole mix, that was really handy for giving the drums just a lot more liveliness. And then I put this satin on there, saturation, which I put on a lot of things really, but it just kind of thickens out the sound, gives it more warmth and more kind of mid-range presence really. You can hear it kind of squashes it a little bit and also brings out some of the detail, some of the subtleties around the edge of the sound that you don't otherwise notice as much before it's been saturated. So that was quite nice, but quite subtle. And then you've got this kick drum here, which is That's a MIDI kick. So that's why I swept the bottom end out of this first kick, because it already had this second one here. And the two of them together they were colliding all over the place and it just didn't work. So I chopped the bass out of this track here and used the bass from this one here. And then I've just done a basic EQ on it, taken out this 160 area, which I find does get muddied up a lot in mixes, 160 to 200 for me. And then I boosted the lows on it, 67. So essentially it's making a bit more room for the bass around this area and allowing it to dominate down at the bottom of the spectrum. And then I put a trigger on, which is actually quite a slappy kind of, not quite clicky kick drum, but kind of more of a slappy kick. Have a listen. Kind of to give it a bit more upper mid-range punch, like we did with this expander boost around the mid-range there on the general kit. This is just on the kick drum. So the way I set up these triggers is you can just click on a track that you want, go Control D, and then basically it converts that track into MIDI, and you can use this threshold here to tell it over what level shall I create a MIDI note. So if you do it on a full drum kit like this, you're obviously going to get a MIDI note for every kick, snare and probably hi-hat as well. So that probably isn't what you're going to want. So what I do if it's a track like this, I make a dummy version of the track with all the high ends swept out. So basically just get an EQ, go to the highest setting possible and go to a high cut and then bring it right the way down here. And then when you hear the track, when you hear the track, you can hear it's just the sub of that kick brought through. So then you bounce that subby version of the kick down, so it's just the kick, and create a dummy track like I've done here, which you don't use after this point, but Waves drum dummy. And then you Control D on that. And because that's just the sub end of the kick drum, you've isolated the kick and you just end up with the MIDI notes from the kick drum. And then you can say OK, and it will create that track. And then you do what I've done here, which you just assign a sample to that. There's loads in Logic. I use this acoustic kit 15, which was give me what I wanted on that upper mid-range. So if we listen to the kit on its own, turn that off. It's quite subtle when it's on its own, but again in the mix it just kind of gave it something extra and allowed you to hear that low end a bit more, because it had something above it kind of cutting through in the mids. You can see before the low end was obviously quite out of control and there wasn't much kind of slappy punch coming through. And I find especially on a drum loop like this was, it works a lot better using kind of an expander rather than just a straight EQ. So you're only really pushing that frequency range out when the transient happens. It just gives that transient extra push rather than that frequency constantly being boosted. Okay then, so on the bass here, what I've done is quite a standard trick, to be honest. Gives you a lot more control of the bass, and basically to split it in two and let this top track here do the top end of the bass, which is like the sort of the detail side of things really, and the bottom end of the bass here to do the sub, which is not really just the sub, it's like everything up to about 160 is on the bottom one, and above 160 is on the top one. So if you have a look here, all I've done is put an EQ there at 18 dBs an octave, 163, and then compress that. It was quite a short attack for me on the bass, 15 milliseconds, released 171 and then pushed fairly hard at 7-1. So let's hear the top bass. You can see that's really taking care of those peaks there, but it's always compressing a little bit. So it's helping to shape the general attack of the bass as well. And then if we go down to the bottom end here, you can see obviously we've got the opposite EQ, but set to 150, so there's a little gap there. And then the compressor attack setting is set differently, crucially. So I've set it a long attack there, 80 milliseconds, so you can really hear that kind of sub pushing out. I find with that kind of style of bass playing, it just works really well, having the sub push through a bit more and not relying on the kind of the top end to cut through the mix. So then these two are combined together on this bass bus here, like this. You blend them together to get the sounds you want, and then I compressed it again with this 1176, and I use this to shape the general attack of the bass and to kind of slot it in the groove. So this compressor I will set whilst I've got the whole mix running in the context of the mix, so I can adjust it to attack and release and get those transients of the bass working with the kick drum and the other transients that are happening around it. And then EQ wise, I've just chopped a little bit out at this 160, 170 area again, because it was conflicting with the drums a little bit. And then it's got a tiny, tiny boost there at 750 hertz, because that's obviously to emphasize that kind of throaty sound of the bass. Let's listen to that with the drums. So that's a good way of controlling your bass in more detail. You can separate out the top and the bottom just like that. So onto the guitars. There's tons of guitars, look. What's that? 13 channels of guitars. So the main takeaway from this, I would say, is use automation. You look at all the automation there, especially on this like first half of the tune. It's stuff like this where it's almost phrase by phrase, and as the song goes through different sections, you know, this is all volume automation, by the way. There's also other automation, but so the way this tune's been recorded and written is all of these guitars are kind of, they're all chiming in together. It's not like one's doing the rhythm part and the other one's doing the lead. They're all doing little bits of both. And together there is a definite thread of like a story being told from the beginning of the song to the end. So basically I was trying to weave these parts together, and so they're all there all the time, but whoever's telling the story at that moment has prominence. So the different guitar parts, they come in and out of focus at different points. And that's why it's got quite so much automation on it, because it's literally, oh, this one has to duck down here while this one tells the bit of the story, and then it goes back up when it comes to prominence here. So a lot of it is because of the sheer amount of guitars that I've done that amount of automation, but usually you end up doing some automation anyway, but I'd say that's the main takeaway from there. To get these guitar tones, they were all given to me as DIs, so I used a few different plugins to get the sort of amp tone. The Saturn, that's got some wicked sounds on it. Doesn't really sound like an amp, I find, but it can sound like a cool guitar effect in a mix. These PRS emulations, I think they're the closest thing to a real amp that I've got anyway. CLA Guitar, that sounds really cool. Again, it's a bit more on the artificial side, but the reamp emulations and the effects and things on here does sound very legitimate, let's say. It sounds like something you would hear in a mix, but that's not the same as it sounding natural. And then the other one I use for the dirty guitars is this JJP guitar here, which, like the CLA, it gives like good, cool guitar effects in a mix, but doesn't necessarily sound natural. So I used a blend of different ones. The thing I really like about the PRS emulation is the way it responds to dynamics with the overdrive. So you'll be able to hear on here when he's playing louder, it's driving the amp harder, and when he plays quietly, you can hear it goes a bit more clean, because the drive is just set to that kind of threshold where he's going across the threshold of it breaking up, basically. But I find that sounds quite natural. I mean, it's still an amp simulation. It still, for me, doesn't sound like an amp, but in the world of amp simulations, it's pretty cool. Have a listen. I'll turn the effects off. You can hear it open up nicely there where it gets a bit louder. And so I used that on a lot of the sounds, and then just built my own effects on top of it. Like this one's got the timeless delay, and it's got a Arturia spring reverb on it, which sounds really nice on the guitars. Turn the effects off. Yeah, so that worked nicely. So here's an example of the CLA Guitar plugin. It's a nice dreamy sounding reverb on that, actually, and delay combination. And just using this this sort of input stage of this plugin gives a nice tone on its own. You can use the reamp as well, but I didn't on that because the reamps are quite overtly reamped, let's say, which does sound nice sometimes, but I wanted something a bit more subtle on there. And I think it sounds quite good. But you can hear definitely it's kind of a completely different effect than using that PRS amp there. Here's an example of another guitar part. This guitar over here, I just made ultra kind of pokey and attacky. Look. I like that sort of really sharp attack, that palm muted sound. Works really nice. So I use this PRS again just to get the initial sound of a real guitar amp, but used it's a different PRS emulation, but it's a clean sound. And then I hit it hard with the DBX 160 compressor. It's only 2-to-1, but it is pushing it quite far into the threshold. And that just kind of pinches it up nicely and kind of gives it that kind of spring-loaded feel to the attack. And then just swept all the lows out of it, so it's really just like a kind of more of a bitey sound. Let's hear that first of all. That's clean. The PRS, the DBX. You can hear the DBX is really emphasising the bow bow dow bit of the riff, and then with the EQ. And let me show you the effects on there. Again, it's just an Arturia spring reverb. And then here I have put a Saturn on there. I wonder what this was for. So bass DI heft. So I've sent it to that Saturn to sort of reamp it and reshape the sound a bit. And then it's sent to a reverb, and just using this true verb, like a plate sound. So I'm not exactly sure what that was for, why I did that. Let's have a listen, just the effects. Okay, so it's making the sends to the reverb just a lot more aggressive and a lot more attitude. And it's this, I think it's just a preset. I don't know if I altered it or what, I might have. But you can see it's, yeah, really poking through in the upper mid-range there. And this one here. So if I turn the effect off, be able to hear what that Saturn is doing. That's with it on. That's with it off. It sounds really wimpy with it off. So it's just making the reverb really aggressive, really, to go with the clean sound. So if you listen to that. Okay, what I also did on here was in the middle of the song, there's a sample here. So that I blended into the tune. Let's hear what it sounds like. That one. Let's hear what it sounds like without anything on it. Me chercher, je te raterai. Mais quand vous avez dit, je suis passé. You can hear there's some upper mid-range harshness on that, quite a bit of it really. So I de-essed it first with this, which is set up to 5.5K. So it's de-essing frequencies over 5.5K, or reducing those frequencies. And then I went for it with the old Pro Q here, if we hear what that sounds like. Mais quand vous avez dit, je suis passé. Mon cœur a brisé, un peu mais maintenant. You see, next to the original, it sounds ridiculously boxy, because that's basically what I was trying to do. Trying to give it more of like a kind of solid push on the vocals, so it could kind of slam through the mid-ranges a bit rather than kind of cutting through in the high mids. So again, I've used this, what I did with the expanders on the drums, but the opposite version of it. So it's essentially a bit of multi-band compression, where I did this cut here and then expanded it, and then I did this cut here and made it dynamic, so it will constantly be cutting at that what's it, 11k, but then when it gets extra harsh, it'll cut it a bit more, like by an extra, what's that, an extra 2 dBs or so. So it just gives you a bit more coverage when it gets a bit too sibilant and bright and attacky. And then it's got the same kind of thing going on there at sort of 3.8k. So that's just to get rid of the harshness. And then I've just boosted the crap out of it, probably too much, like 8 dBs at 400 hertz. And isolated, to be fair, that sounds really boxy. But then I put this CLA vocals on it just to polish it off at the end. Like as with the guitar, I find the input stage of this really adds a nice sweetness to it, even if you don't use much of these here. You can see I've just used the compression and just brightened it back up again, where I've done so much cut with that EQ. So let's listen to the CLA part on and off.
Quand tu me cherchais, je te ratais. Mais quand vous avez dit, je suis passé. Mon cœur a brisé, un peu, mais maintenant, je sais que je suis libre.
Yeah, I think with the spanking is leveling out that boxiness that would have been added by that big 400 hertz boost. But overall in the mix, that seemed to work quite nice.
Quand tu me cherchais, je te ratais. Mais quand vous avez dit, je suis passé. Mon cœur a brisé, un peu, mais maintenant, je sais que je suis libre. Je ne souhaiterais cela.
You hear with it all turned off, like I just did there halfway through, it's a super bright sort of cutting vocal, and I'm just not so fond of that sort of sound really, although it's totally valid. So that was how I got that, and then you've got another guest vocalist on here,
Well, you don't know.
which again is another sample, and I did a bit less to this. I just used the satin on it to warm it up and squash the dynamics as well here a little bit. You see I've got that set quite high, and then again CLA vocals with roughly the same settings as the other sample, but then I've just boosted up the stereo width of it a little bit, which does sound really nice when those backing vocals come in on this sample. And then what else have I done here? I've automated the pitch. Okay, so yeah, that's where I've pushed up the stereo width when these backing vocals join in here. You can see that stereo width goes up, and it did give a nice bit of variation to it. But then I've sent the whole vocal over to some effects, which again is this Pro R called French Reverb. So that's definitely my own setting. Yeah, a bit of a longer reverb, 1 second, and it's got this H delay before it with 90 millisecond delay, no feedback, so it's just giving sort of one repeat of the original sound. And then the dry and wet settings set sort of 50-50, so you're sending some of your sort of undelayed signal to the reverb, and the same amount of your delayed signal is also going to the reverb, so you've got both of them kind of colliding in there. So essentially it sort of emulates early reflections, but is a lot more of a simulated kind of synthetic version of it. But I quite like that sound, and it seemed to work well for this. So first of all, let me show you what the effects are doing.
Well, you don't know. Red, yellow, white, black, green, and brown, and all the exotic gal, Mr. Shammy Crowning.
So that delay is actually on the sample already that you just heard there. If I turn my delays off.
Well, you don't know. Red, yellow, white, black, green, and brown, and all the exotic gal, Mr. Shammy Crowning.
So you can hear there, it just...
Well, you don't know. Red, yellow, white, black, green, and brown, and all the exotic gal, Mr. Shammy Crowning.
You can hear how that delay in there is just giving it a bit more of a sort of megaphone type vibe.
Well, you don't know. Red, yellow, white, black, green, and brown, and all the exotic gal, Mr. Shammy Crowning.
So essentially giving you a pre-delayed sound as well as a not pre-delayed sound. So that's quite cool. And then this Saturn here is graining it up quite a bit. You can hear.
Well, you don't know. Red, yellow, white, black, green, and brown, and all the exotic gal, Mr. Shammy Crowning. Hey,
Girl from Bombay, just give them the bad girl wine.
wine.
Girl from Bombay, just give them the rude girl wine.
So you can hear the Saturn's crunching it up quite a bit there, and you heard that stereo lift there. So if I put it in context.
Well, you don't know. Red, yellow, white, black, green, and brown, and all the exotic gal, Mr. Shammy Crowning. Hey,
Girl from Bombay, just give them the bad girl wine.
wine.
Girl from Bombay, just give them the rude girl wine.
I know you love me.
Such a thing in your wildest dreams. There's a twinkling rainbow blazed across the midnight sky. Why did I ask that question? I often wonder why. I could not explain the answers even though I have to.
Je te raté. Mais quand vous avez dit, je suis passé. Mon cœur a brisé un peu, mais maintenant je sais que je suis libre. Je ne souhaiterais cela à personne. Il est pas mauvais, mais tu vas bien. Les choses qui ne tuent pas et rendent de force. C'est pourquoi elle revient avec moi. Well, you don't know. Red, yellow, white, black, green, and brown, and all the exotic gal, Mr. Shammy Crowning. Hey,
Girl from Bombay, just give them the bad girl wine.
wine.
Girl from Bombay, just give them the rude girl
I
wine.
know you love me now, but it's too late. Found another guy, I can be your boo thing. Funny how you want me to come back, but it ain't gonna happen, cause I just found myself. Je ne souhaiterais cela à personne. Elle est très mauvaise, mais elle ne sera pas avec moi.
You're hoping the dreams will open wide. Nature is behind the sky. behind the disguise. Rollers waves, powder and gold. Unique and sublime until we crash in the show. Oh, you're hoping the trees will open your eyes. Reveal the nature of us behind the disguise. Riders waves, powder and gold. Unique and sublime until we crash on the show.
Yes, thank you. You got to the end of the video. Now I explain why we're in this warehouse instead. Basically, I'm ripping out the studio. It's Christmas time and I'm ripping out the studio, rewiring it all, putting a patch bay in, putting loads of new acoustic treatment in. I'm doing it all at the same time. So it's a complete mess in there. So I thought I'd do this intro just out here. And it's really echoey because of all these cables. They make it really echoey. Like I think it's to do with these holes in here. The echo sort of comes out of there or something. So I'll do another video about that at some point. But it's pretty cool. So yeah, I use all these cables for live sound stuff. This would be a hell of a studio patch, I suppose, if you're doing like an orchestra or something. But no, this is for live sound stuff that I do with my other business, Audio Crew. Thanks for watching the video. I hope it was useful. And I will see you later. Don't forget to like and subscribe down there. Nice one.